Thank you, Brian. Thank you. Well, good evening. I think we're pretty much back on track on time, but I'll probably change that. I actually thought I was going to speak about the economy, and I arrived here and saw that it had on the listing that I was going to be speaking about the Olympics. Well, I might touch on the Olympics, but I'm going to stay with the talk that I thought I was going to give, which is talking about the global economy. But obviously the global economy and the Olympics are actually inextricably interlinked in many, many ways. So I'll touch on the Olympics towards the end, but I really want to address what's going on in terms of the geopolitical meltdown, the contrived geopolitical meltdown, and look at how this is potentially going to unfold literally in the coming weeks. Now, the first time that I actually alluded to the imminence of a global collapse was actually in July of 2007. It's actually in the same presentation where I first actually recorded the statement that I anticipated an event occurring at the London Olympics which would be used to accelerate the establishment of a global government. And that was recorded in July 2007, and it's a presentation called Fool Me Once. Well, here we are, 10 days, not even, before 6 days actually, 6 days before the Olympics are due to start, and I'm even more convinced that the London Olympics are going to be used as a backdrop to stage an event of such enormous audacity. And the purpose is going to be to accelerate the establishment of a one-world government. And if any of you are around North London on Wednesday evening, it's Wednesday the 25th, we have an evening which I'm calling the perfect storm, the perfect G4S storm. And Ben, who you saw earlier today, will be giving a presentation there, as will Tony Gosling, the journalist who first broke Ben's insights into G4S. Ben, having tried to get the mainstream media to take an interest and basically being fobbed off, eventually managed to get Tony Gosling on his Bristol radio show to report what was occurring within G4S. And of course, since then, the whole thing has literally gone mega. But what I'm going to demonstrate on Wednesday evening is that the whole of the meltdown with G4S is a contrived event. And I challenge anybody to leave on Wednesday evening still believing that it was just an unfortunate situation which Nick Buckles could never have foreseen. Nothing happens by accident. And exactly the same with the global financial collapse. So in 2007, I don't claim any special insights. I had simply read the scripts and knew my history, which is why, of course, Tony Blair wanted to shut down the teaching of history in schools, because these guys who perpetrate these outrageous agendas are pretty limited in their creativity, and so they tend to use the same template time and time and time again. And as Edmund Burke famously said, those who don't know history are destined to repeat it, and really that's exactly what's occurring right now. And it was the same in 2007, because in 2007 we were in exactly the same situation as effectively the Western world was in 1928, late 1928, early 1929. So it was pretty apparent to those of us that knew that history what was going to occur. So in that presentation in July of 2007, I said we are on the cusp, we are absolutely on the cusp of the global financial collapse. And of course, 1 month after that presentation, Northern Rock was the first British bank to go to the wall. Somehow the property market seemed to stay buoyant for another 3 months until October, and then after that we went into this current decline. A decline which David Cameron said a few days ago that he sees continuing until at least the year 2020, which should give you a clue that there is a strategy, but it's not the one that they're alluding to the general population. And I want to share this quote from a website. This appeared on a website which is SHTFP LAN, except that it's SHTF plan, and SHTF stands for shithitthefan.plan.com. Shithitthefan.plan.com. And this is what Marco Salvo had to say. He said, when this Ponzi scheme finally comes down, it will be unlike anything we've seen in terms of economic collapse and financial asset annihilation. He said, it turns out that there are whistleblowers, hundreds of them, but any attack on the establishment is met with either a full-on counterattack that targets the credibility of the individual bringing forth the information and marginalizes the content of the message by dismissing it as the ravings of a lunatic or a disgruntled employee. Or it's simply erased from public view by the very institutions tasked with investigating such activity. Well, that pretty much applies, of course, to everything. I mean, even Ben, discovered that the news wasn't welcomed by the mainstream media, so they just completely shut it down. But every now and again, somebody does manage to slip through and get something onto the mainstream media which they were totally unprepared for. And one such individual was a guy called Alessio Rastani. And Alessio Rastani is an independent trader. He's an American of Italian descent, but he's an independent trader. He was working in London with his own financial advisory practice and trading practice. And somehow he was selected, randomly apparently, by the BBC to comment about the economy. And this 3-minute clip that I'm going to share with you is probably the most iconic of anything that has appeared on the BBC in recent history. And we're going to listen to what Alessio has to say, and in that 3 minutes he comes up with some remarkably prescient observations that he could not have known would actually pan out in the way they did just a few weeks later.
It's going to crash, and it's going to fall pretty hard, because markets are ruled right now by fear. Investors and the big money, the smart money, I'm talking about the big funds, the hedge funds, the institutions, they don't buy this rescue plan. They basically, they know the market is toast. They know the stock market is finished. The euro, as far as they're concerned, they don't really care. They're moving their money away to safer assets, like treasury bonds, 30-year bonds, and the US dollar. So it's not going to work.
We keep hearing that whatever the politicians are suggesting, and admittedly it's all been rather woolly so far, isn't right. Can you pin down exactly what would keep investors happy, make them feel more confident?
That's a tough one. Personally, it doesn't matter. See, I'm a trader. I don't really care about that kind of stuff. I go with if I see an opportunity to make money, I go with that. So for most traders, it's not about we don't really care that much how they're going to fix the economy, how they're going to fix the whole situation. Our job is to make money from it. And personally, I've been dreaming of this moment for 3 years. I have a confession, which is I go to bed every night, I dream of another recession. I dream of another moment like this. Why? Because people don't seem to maybe remember, but the 30s depression, the depression in the 30s, wasn't just about a market crash. There were some people who were prepared to make money from that crash. And I think anybody can do that. It isn't just for some people in the elite. Anybody can actually make money. It's an opportunity. When the market crashes, when the euro and the big stock markets crash, if you know what to do, if you have the right plan to set up, you can make a lot of money from this. For example, hedging strategies is one. Then investing in bonds, treasury bonds, that sort of stuff.
If you could see the people around me, jaws have collectively dropped at what you've just said. I mean, we appreciate your candour, however, it doesn't help the rest of us, does it, or the rest of the Eurozone?
I would say this, listen, I would say this to everybody who's watching this. This economic crisis is like a cancer. If you just wait and wait thinking this is going to go away, just like a cancer, it's going to grow and it's going to be too late. What I would say to everybody is get prepared. This is not a time right now to wishful thinking the government is going to sort things out. The governments don't rule the world. Goldman Sachs rules the world. Goldman Sachs does not care about this rescue package, neither does the big funds. So actually, what I would actually tell people, I want to help people. People can make money from this. It isn't just traders. What they need to do is learn about how to make money from a downward market. The first thing people should do is protect their assets, protect what they have. Because in less than 12 months, my prediction is that savings of millions of people is going to vanish. And this is just the beginning. So I would say be prepared and act now. The biggest risk people can take right now is not acting.
Alessio Rostani, thank you very much for talking to us.
Do you dream about the economy at night?
I try not to.
Yeah.
Nightmares.
You would think, having made those observations, that Alessio would immediately be signed up to appear on Question Time or Paxman and be grilled, because he'd made some pretty outrageous observations here, and I mean, surely they were worthy of further investigation, either to expose the guy as the charlatan that they subsequently claimed he was. But of course he wasn't invited on Question Time or Paxman because the guy had got a little bit too close to the truth. So the following day, he was demonized in all the mainstream media as an imposter, as a charlatan. And they even tried to suggest he was a member of the Yes Men. And it was actually his former employer in the US who came to his rescue and said, this guy's no imposter, no charlatan. He's simply sharing what we taught him when he was working with us for 5 years. But it's the classic, it's what Marco said in his quote on shithitthefanplan.com. If somebody happens to get too close to the mark and comes up with information that clearly marks them as a whistleblower, then they are demonized and dismissed. Well, in the course of that interview, he made some very, very astute observations. And I'm going to break it down a little bit because, I don't, unlike Alessio, I don't go to bed every night dreaming of the next recession. But, I have got myself into a position where I really don't care what happens in many respects because I've insulated myself as much as possible. And this is what Alessio's trying to do here. What you see is a trader. His job is to make money and make money for his clients. And he has a strategy in place. And what he's trying to do by appearing on this program is actually encourage people to start thinking about what's coming down the pipe. And if you have some insight as to what's coming, you can start to make some preparations. Because as he said nearly a year ago, this is like a cancer. And if you don't take any precautions, you pretty much know what the end result is going to be. So back in September, when this interview was recorded, he said, within 12 months, the savings of millions of people will evaporate. I happen to concur with Alessio when he now says that the savings of millions of people will evaporate within the next few months. Maybe as soon as late September or mid-October. So what I'm going to do as we go through this is offer us some insight maybe as to the sort of strategy that can be adopted to avoid getting caught up in this drama. Because that's what these guys want. Of course, they want people caught up in the drama, caught up in the fear, so that they effectively become malleable. And they'll do exactly what they're told to do. But of course, his classic statement there was, governments don't rule the world. Goldman Sachs rules the world. Well, he might not be totally accurate in that statement. I mean, obviously, it was a bit of a throwaway line. But he's closer to the mark than maybe he realized. Because Goldman Sachs may not rule the world, but they are certainly the mechanics who help bring about, or are helping to bring about, the total collapse. So let me introduce you to this guy. This is Lloyd Blankfein. He's the chief executive officer of Goldman Sachs. And this picture here is actually from the front of the Sunday Times magazine, from an article that appeared, I think it was around about October 2009. So, the global collapse was already well underway, and the Sunday Times devoted a 12-page spread to Lloyd Blankfein and Goldman Sachs. And in the course of that interview, he said, I believe I'm doing God's work. Where have you heard that before? I believe I'm doing God's work. Well, of course, God's work is actually quite lucrative, if you can get it. Because whilst the world has been going to hell in the proverbial handcart, he has earned the princely sum of $160.9 million. As you can see, in 2008, he had a bit of a lean year. I think he had to apply for food stamps that year. He only got his base salary. His base salary is $1.1 million. All the rest of the income is based on bonus and stock options. Well, the reason that he got $64 million the following year is simply that the bonus from 2008 was deferred to 2009 because it would have looked a little bit iffy to the general public if this guy had got his 30-odd million bonus when the world had just had one of the worst years in economic history. So it was deferred. This is the way in which these guys do it. It's simply deferred until people are looking somewhere else and then they get the bonus. By the way, this guy's earnings are directly comparable with the earnings of Bob Diamond over the same period. Remember Bob Diamond? Yeah? The guy basically caught red-handed. Well, they just haven't caught the rest yet. But the guy on point in terms of the LIBOR scandal. Well, when he said he's doing God's work, it ain't your God, it ain't my God, but I think it's this God. The God of gold, oil, and drugs. These guys have an agenda which is to put the general population in total, abject, economic slavery. They've already pretty much achieved that in Greece, well on the way to doing it in Spain, and in Ireland. Now, when we talk about this, it doesn't mean to say that everybody in the country is in the depths of the austerity measures. And this is what they rely on. They rely on the fact that the majority, i.e. more than 50% of the people, aren't caught up in this. And so therefore the majority just don't want to get involved. It's not affecting me right now, so I'm just going to look the other way. The fact that people, particularly in the States, are getting evicted from their houses, having to live in tent cities in the parks on the edge of the urban areas, the fact that there's houses unoccupied. In fact, in the States, they're starting to bulldoze the unoccupied houses to prevent them from being occupied by squatters. The game plan is to put the majority of the population effectively in abject economic slavery. Now, when Alessio said that governments don't rule the world, Goldman Sachs rules the world, he could not have realized just how prescient that statement was. Because literally, within a few weeks of him making that statement, the leaders of both Greece and Italy had effectively been replaced. And they had been replaced, unelected, by the technocrats of Brussels and the European Central Bank and the IMF. But they had put these individuals in for a particular reason. And the reason is that they are former associates of Goldman Sachs. When Papandreou in Greece suggested that perhaps he should initiate a referendum to give the Greek people the opportunity to decide whether or not they wanted to accept the very severe austerity measures that were being put forward by the IMF and the European Central Bank. And of course, as soon as they heard referendum, they went into apoplexy. So they maneuvered a situation where he was forced out of office and he was replaced by a guy called Lucas Papademos. Lucas Papademos had been the head of the Greek National Bank, working in close collusion with Goldman Sachs to falsify the Greek national accounts, to put a lot of the debt off the books, to convince the EU and the European Central Bank that Greece had met all of the economic requirements to join the EU and the Eurozone, when of course they hadn't. And Greece was a basket case before it even came into the EU. But the strategists knew this, and they knew that by bringing Greece into the EU and into the Eurozone, it would accelerate the collapse of the EU and particularly the Eurozone. And then in Italy, of course, one can argue that Silvio effectively presented his head on the proverbial silver platter, but nonetheless, he had been elected into office. And he was forced out of office and replaced by Mario Monti, a former EU commissioner and former associate of Goldman Sachs. Well, let's have a look at Nigel Farage, what Nigel Farage had to say about that particular incident.
Co-president of the Europe of Freedom and Democracy, Nigel Farage. The floor is yours.
Well, here we are, on the edge of a financial and social disaster, and in the room today we have the four men who were supposed to be responsible. And yet we've listened to the dullest, most technocratic speeches I've ever heard. You are all in denial. By any objective measure, the euro is a failure. And who is actually responsible? And who's in charge out of you lot? Well, of course, the answer is none of you, because none of you have been elected, none of you actually have any democratic legitimacy for the roles that you currently hold within this crisis. And into this vacuum, albeit reluctantly, has stepped Angela Merkel. And we are now living in a German-dominated Europe. Something that the European project was actually supposed to stop. Something that those that went before us actually paid a heavy price in blood to prevent. I don't want to live in a German-dominated Europe, and nor do the citizens of Europe. But you guys have played a role, because when Mr Papandreou got up and used the word referendum, or Mr Rehn, you described it as a breach of confidence, and your friends here got together like a pack of hyenas, rounded on Papandreou, had him removed and replaced by a puppet government. What an absolutely disgusting spectacle that was. And not satisfied with that, you decided that Berlusconi had to go. So he was removed and replaced by Mr Monti, a former European Commissioner, a fellow architect of this euro disaster, and a man who wasn't even a member of the Parliament. It's getting like an Agatha Christie novel, where we're trying to sort of work out who's the next person that's going to be bumped off. The difference is we know who the villains are. You should all be held accountable for what you've done. You should all be fired. And I have to say, Mr Van Rompuy, 18 months ago when we first met, I was wrong about you. I said you'd be the quiet assassin of nation-state democracy, but you're not anymore. You're rather noisy about it, aren't you? You, an unelected man, went to Italy and said this is not the time for elections, but the time for actions. What in God's name gives you the right to say that to the Italian people?
Thank you. Then
Now, I'm not advocating UKIP. UKIP is, without any shadow of doubt, controlled opposition. If I was ever in any doubt of that, I can tell you, spending 4 days in the company of Lord Christopher Monckton put any doubts I had to rest. But Nigel Farage shoots from the hip. Ever since he had his near-death experience in the run-up to the last UK elections, he doesn't give a damn. He tells it like it is. But you're not going to see his comments reported on the BBC anytime soon. The only place you're likely to see them is Russia Today or on YouTube. That's completely outrageous. But he's telling the truth. He's telling truth to power. But the bottom line is that the EU Parliament has no teeth. It's a consultative body. A trade union shop steward has more influence in the running of a company than the MEPs do in establishing EU legislation. The MEPs are not even told what legislation is coming down the pipe. The legislation is generated by the bureaucrats. It's up to the MEPs to establish through their researchers what's coming down the pipe, and if they have any problem with it, to flag it up and then raise it in the consultative body. But in reality, they influence basically nothing. Nothing. It's a talking shop. I found a better picture of Mr. Rompuy, by the way, though. We may have him the wrong way around, I'm not sure. But of course, Rompuy was put into this role because he is a non-entity. He's a political non-entity. He's a non-entity in his own country. He's a non-entity in the EU. He doesn't seek the limelight. It's pretty Machiavellian, but the whole idea is to create the impression amongst the European population that the role of EU president is nothing more than a sinecure. It's just a role where you put a long-serving statesman out to pasture, chairs a few meetings, sits in on the EU Parliament from time to time. But if you've read the Treaty of Lisbon, you will know that that could not be further from the truth. The EU president is granted despotic powers. And you know who's being groomed to take over, don't you? Tony Blair, the arch socio-psychotic of all time. If ever you wanted categoric proof that Tony Blair is a socio-psychotic, look no further than an interview that he gave with Andrew Marr, probably about 18 months or so ago now. Now, Andrew Marr is no Paxman, but every now and again, Andrew does ask a pertinent question. And he actually said to Blair, he said, "So, Mr. Blair, how do you actually sleep at night knowing that some 500,000 Iraqi civilians, mainly women and children, have been killed as a result of the quest to find what we now know to be non-existent weapons of mass destruction?" And you know what Blair's response was? He said, "Actually, Andrew, I think you'll find it's only 100,000. So that makes it all right then. A normal human being, blessed with the capacity for love and compassion, would be mortified if we thought that our words or deeds had effectively caused harm to one other person. But for Tony Blair, it's okay because it's only 100,000. And this is the guy who now wants to come back into politics. This guy clearly has no capacity for self-reflection. He is completely unable to see that he is reviled by the British people. I mean, he is a proven liar, but I don't think he realizes he's lying because he's a socio-psychotic. But this is the guy who would be the next EU president. Now, if I was ever in any doubt about the fact that he's being groomed for that role, that was put to rest when, of course, he announced that he was converting to Catholicism. Because the EU president must be a Catholic. The EU is a Catholic entity, and of course the Catholic Church is a Babylonian entity, the EU is a Babylonian entity. If ever there was any doubt about that, just go check out the architecture of the Strasbourg Parliamentary Building, because of course it's based on Bruegel's depiction of the Tower of Babel. They obviously couldn't find an architect, so they just decided to copy the painting. In the UK, ever since the days of Henry VIII, we will not have anything to do with Catholics in senior office. So it is absolute anathema today for a Catholic to be Prime Minister of the UK. We can have a Jewish Prime Minister, we've had a few. In theory, we can have a Buddhist, a Muslim, a Sikh, in theory, but not a Catholic. But with the EU, it's completely the other way around. And that's why Tony Blair had to convert to Catholicism so that he effectively ticked all the boxes to be a future EU president. Of course, he wanted to go down in history. He's obsessed, like all narcissists. He's obsessed with creating this place in history. So he wanted to go down in history as the first EU president. But he's going to go down in history probably as the EU president that leads the world into Armageddon, unless somebody gets there first, of course. So here we are, in the grip, the 5th year of the global financial collapse. The EU can't do anything about it. Farage waxes lyrical on the subject, but he's impotent. We have two houses in Westminster which are effectively financially illiterate. Either that, or of course they know exactly what's going on, but they're so deep in the trough that they daren't acknowledge the fact that it's not the population who determine the policy through their government, it is effectively the financial community. It is the bankers. That's why 5 years into the global economic collapse, there are no solutions being put forward by governments or the media or anybody working in the financial community. But there is one country that's managed to find a way out. A country that just 3.5 years ago had a total economic collapse. And of course, you've read absolutely nothing about this country in the mainstream media. You've heard very little about this country on the mainstream TV news shows. That country, of course, is Iceland. And the reason that Iceland is now in growth mode is because it did the right thing and it told the bankers to take a hike. Because the Icelandic parliament, when it collapsed, expecting that when it announced that it was going to have an election, expecting to be re-elected, of course it wasn't. And a lot of people came forward and put themselves forward for election who'd never stood for parliament, never considered standing for parliament. And so when the elections were held in early 2009, many of the MPs were returned as MPs for the first time, and many of them were women. And this was absolutely critical to them getting out of this mess, because the women were not constrained by previous experience. And their attitude was, the men fucked it up and it's the women that are going to have to put it right. And you know what? They were absolutely right. And of course the IMF came along and said, we're here to help. And the Icelandic government said, well, thanks very much, but why on earth would we ever turn to a body that was supposed to actually prevent this from occurring? No thanks, we'll go somewhere else. And the IMF said, no, you don't understand. You can't get out of this without our help. And they said, oh, really? Watch. And here they are, 3.5 years further on, and the country isn't necessarily in boom mode, but it has an economy that is growing at 2.7%. Now, a couple of years ago, when they were starting to really get their act together, I jokingly said, sometime in the next few years, you can expect to be reading in the mainstream media that Iceland is suspected of having weapons of mass destruction. Well, it hasn't quite reached that far yet, but what you didn't read in the mainstream media was that a few weeks ago, the US Navy fired a shot across the bows of an Icelandic trawler. And what they are doing is they are trying to destroy the burgeoning economy of Iceland by restricting the Icelandic trawling fleet to fishing within inside its own 200-mile limit. So what they're doing is they're effectively preventing the Icelanders from fishing in international waters. This is sanctions by subterfuge. Iceland, prior to the fishermen thinking that they could make more money by getting into banking, had a tremendous economy built on fishing. Another country in the EU should have an economy built around fishing, and that's Ireland. Because of where Ireland sits on the extreme western edge of the EU, Ireland is blessed by having 23% of all EU territorial waters. So in theory, Ireland should be producing approximately 23% of all the fish consumed within the EU. But thanks to their corrupt politicians, they sold 19 of that 23% for a one-off payment of €6 billion. So today, the Irish are only permitted to fish just 4% of their 23%. So it's effectively 1/8 of their own territorial waters is all they're permitted to fish and contribute to the economy. Ireland was a target, a specific target, because Ireland sits on enormous hydrocarbon wealth. Most of the hydrocarbons actually sit on the extreme edge of Ireland's territorial waters, somewhere around between 170, 190 miles off of the west and southwest coast of Ireland. So pretty hostile waters. Those deposits, those hydrocarbon deposits, have been known about for a long time. But of course, whilst oil was less than $10 a barrel, which it was right up until 13 years ago, with oil less than $10 a barrel, it just wasn't viable. Now, with oil pushing $100 a barrel, it's a viable proposition. And woe betide the fact or the possibility that Ireland realises just how much wealth it's sitting on. The Irish nation are potentially sitting on hydrocarbon deposits at least equal to that of the UK and Norway combined. But that has effectively been sucked away from the Irish people, or given away by corrupt politicians. What's going on here is a game of global monopoly. Has everybody here played Monopoly? Yeah? Anybody awake? Okay. Anybody played Monopoly? Okay, good. Has anybody ever finished a game of Monopoly? Without blood? Yeah. Okay, how many people, can I see your hands, how many people have finished a game of Monopoly? Okay, a handful, good. Can you leave your hand up if you were the banker? Well, the game of Monopoly is a pretty good reflection of what's going on right now. The name of the game is Monopoly. Most people never actually fulfill the intention of the game. The game comes out on Boxing Day when somebody says, let's have a game of Monopoly, and everyone else goes, oh God, if we must. And you sit around, you play for about 4 hours, and then you agree to put the board away. And then somebody says the following day, let's carry on with the game of Monopoly. So you carry on again. Eventually everyone gets so bored with it, you simply agree to add up the accumulated wealth of each individual, and whoever's got the most declare them the winner. But that's not the purpose of the game. The purpose of the game is total ownership of the board. Total ownership. Last man standing. And the game goes through certain phases. Initially, of course, the game is pump-primed with everybody being given a pot of money. Not loaned, given. And you use that money to buy up the locations on the board. And once you've got a set of locations, and maybe you have to do a bit of bartering with your competitors to get a complete set, but once you've got a complete set, you can actually start building up your property empire. You start with houses, then you go to hotels. And once all the players have got their locations loaded with houses and hotels, then the real game starts, which is literally about wiping out your opponents. Well, that's exactly what's going on in the global economy right now. We're in the final round. And the bankers, the banksters, have got the bit between their teeth. And they are going for total ownership of the board. They've pretty much achieved it in Greece. Under Lucas Papademos, he's effectively signed away all the Greek national treasures, signed away a lot of the Greek islands, and signed a deal that says if they need any more money, they have to get it from the IMF or the European Central Bank. So even if the Russians or the Chinese or anybody else comes in with a better offer, they're not at liberty to take it up. Total ownership of the board. It's going to be the same in Spain. It's going to be the same in Ireland, in Italy, and it's coming here. It's coming here. Maybe sooner than you realize, because we are literally on the brink now of the final collapse. There are many, many commentators and watchers of the global economy who believe that the coming collapse, the mega collapse, the one that Marco talks about, and he says when this Ponzi scheme collapses, it'll be bigger than anyone can even begin to comprehend. And this could well happen at the end of September. It'll certainly, I think, happen sometime between mid-September and mid-November, because that's when a lot of the debts are due to be settled. A lot of the bonds are due to be settled. And we have nothing left. Everything now is in private ownership. Anything that isn't in private ownership soon will be. So when we say capitalism isn't working, it is. It's working brilliantly. It's doing exactly what it was intended to do. And the architects play a long game, a very long game. I mean, they upped the game basically in 1971. That was the point. August the 15th, actually, we can pinpoint it. The day at which Henry Kissinger instructed Richard Nixon to remove the US dollar from the gold standard so that it could be used and established as the global reserve currency. It took them another couple of years, 1973, when they used the Middle East crisis to hike the oil price by 400%. And they told the OPEC members that they had to be the fall guys here. They had to take a bit of stick from the Western media because the West was going to blame OPEC for hiking the oil price, but it was actually Kissinger going to OPEC and saying, we have a plan. We need you to hike the price of oil by 400%. In return, you need to accept petrodollars as the global reserve currency. And the purpose of this was to put the petrodollars into the oil-producing countries so that they could buy US products. Arms. If you sell enough arms, you can eventually create events like an Arab Spring. You've got to make sure that both sides, though, are balanced in terms of the arms they have. You know, you want a revolution in this country? Anybody got any first clue where you start to go and get Semtex and rocket-propelled grenades or machine guns? Of course not. The only way you get them is when a foreign power comes along and effectively provides them for you, which is exactly, of course, what's going on right now. So we are literally on a cusp of a collapse. And when Alessio talks about, within the space of a few weeks now, the savings of millions of people will evaporate, you've got two choices. If you do nothing, you better start preparing to kiss goodbye to anything that you have that's sitting in a bank that you've worked all your life to accumulate. And if you're quite happy with that, then there's no issue. I will say that right now, a very good position to be in is to have nothing. Because if you have nothing, you're not really going to miss it, are you? Yeah, and you'll know that, basically one way or another, you'll always get by. But for those people who have worked hard to accumulate perhaps a pension pot or, a sizable investment portfolio, there is the very real potential that it's about to be stripped away. So if you've got any money in the bank, better start thinking about what you're going to do with it, because I think that getting it out of the bank should be a priority. Right now, the only thing you should have in the bank is an overdraft, and preferably a big one. And if you haven't got a big overdraft, go get one. And whatever you can borrow, start thinking about what you could do with it. Well, what are you going to do with it? Well, let's take a look at what happens when the people who know what's going on in the global economy take their money out of the banks. This is the price of gold over the last 10 years. And over the last 10 years, even though we've had this drop over the last 12 months, exactly 12 months, gold peaked last July at $1,900 an ounce, which was way too high for the liking of the Federal Reserve. So since August of last year, the Federal Reserve have been doing a LIBOR-type scandal and holding the price of gold down. This is what is known as voluntary confiscation. So the price of gold right now is just under $1,600 an ounce. And there isn't a pundit on the planet who doesn't believe that gold is a safe haven right now. Gold or silver or almost any precious metal. Because the fiat paper currency in your back pocket is going to have the same value as the paper currency in that Monopoly box in a few weeks. So how does the savings evaporate? Well, the savings evaporates when the currencies effectively collapse and you need £100,000 to buy a loaf of bread. Outrageous. No, that's what happened in Germany. It's what happened in Argentina a decade ago. So we're not talking something that's off the wall here. We're talking about things that have happened when particular countries have been targeted. And generally they're targeted because they're not playing ball with the Rothschilds banking system. By the way, this is one of the reasons that J.K. Rowling is as high in the rich list as she is, although she has made $1 or $3 from the royalties of A Boy Wizard. The primary reason she sits as high up the rich list as she does is because she invested in gold back here. And so she's seen that enormous return. By the way, this is the point at which Gordon Brown was instructed to sell 400 tons of the UK's 715-ton gold reserves. He was instructed to sell it by the Rothschilds to, who was it now? The Rothschilds. The UK and a number of other European countries were instructed to sell their gold to provide the base capital to start the European Central Bank. So the European Central Bank has effectively managed to blow its base capital, its startup capital, and a hell of a lot more in the space of, barely 12 years. It's deliberate. It's asset stripping. Why do you think Mitt Romney is the preferred candidate in the US? If they have to have an alternative to Obama, and I think they're going to do everything they can to keep Obama in office, but if they have to have an alternative to Obama, who could be easily manipulated, they want a guy like Romney who's proven that he doesn't give a shit about humanity, and he will simply just carry on doing what he was doing at Maine. Bain, was it Bain? It was John Perkins who worked at Maine. Mitt Romney was Bain. He would just continue what he was doing at Bain and effectively destroy the nation. So it doesn't matter who the hell you vote for, of course, just like here. It's the same wings of a different bird. But if you go, before you rush out and buy gold, I am going to share this with you, because the purpose of buying gold is not to get rich. The purpose of buying gold is to protect what you have. Because gold will always hold its purchasing power. Back in the days after the Second World War, it was said that one gold coin would buy you a reasonable quality suit. Today, one gold coin, a sovereign, will buy you a reasonable quality suit. Okay, albeit from Marks and Spencer's, but it's £240 odd, £230 for a sovereign. It'll buy you a reasonable quality suit. A lot of people in this country still believe that there was a housing boom between 2002 and 2007. Smoke and mirrors. Smoke and mirrors. Back here in 2002, you needed 363 ounces of gold to buy the average property in this country. Today, you need barely 100 ounces of gold to buy the average property in this country. So in real terms, the average property in this country is worth around about 30% of what it was 10 years ago, in real terms. This is the brilliance of the smoke and mirrors. You create the impression that the population think they're doing well while effectively investing in a commodity that is depreciating in value. Well, Ron Paul makes a tremendous effort in the US to educate people about the importance of gold. And I'm just going to show you a very short clip of Ron Paul in a House hearing where he's grilling Ben Bernanke, who's the head of the Federal Reserve, and he's trying to get Ben Bernanke to acknowledge the significance of gold. But Ben Bernanke knows that potentially hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people are watching this live. And so he has to be very careful what he says, because, of course, what he can't afford to do is to start a gold rush. So in just 1 minute, watch Ben Bernanke wriggle as Ron Paul tries to nail him to the spot.
Very quickly, if you could answer another question, because I'm curious about this. You know, the price of gold today is $1,580. The dollar during these last 3 years was devalued almost 50%. When you wake up in the morning, do you care about the price of gold?
Well, I pay attention to the price of gold, but I think it reflects a lot of things. It reflects global uncertainties. I think the reason people hold gold is as a protection against what we call tail risk, really, really bad outcomes. And to the extent that the last few years have made people more worried about the potential of a major crisis, then they have gold as a protection.
Do you think gold is money?
No.
It's not money. Even if it has been money for 6,000 years, somebody reversed that and eliminated that economic law.
Well, it's an asset. I mean, it's the same. Would you say Treasury bills are money? I don't think they're money either, but they're a financial asset.
Why do central banks hold it?
Well, it's a form of reserves.
Why don't they hold diamonds?
Well, it's tradition, long-term tradition.
Well, some people still think it's money. I yield back. My time is up. Thank you.
Weasley words there. But of course, Ben Bernanke is tasked with maintaining the supremacy of the fiat US dollar. And so he will do anything rather than acknowledge the significance of gold. And of course, the US is still the only country to have actually formally introduced legislation, which it did in March of 1934, where it instructed its citizens to hand their gold over to the banks in return for, I think it was $27.50 at the time. And if they failed to do so, then they ran the risk of large fines and even imprisonment, which is why today a lot of Americans are going across to Mexico, and then they're buying gold in Mexico and then bringing it back across the border. So the border guards, the INS, the Immigration Naturalization Service, the border guards right along that massive border that runs from California right across to Texas. The INS service is paid for by Big Pharma to prevent people going across to Mexico and buying cheap medicines, and the Federal Reserve to prevent people going across to Mexico to buy gold. And if they catch people smuggling it, then of course they just confiscate it. This is the paranoia. So anybody still think that the US is the epitome of the free world? It's smoke and mirrors. The same as here. It's smoke and mirrors. Now, before you all rush out and buy gold, there's a couple of other sort of priorities here. I'm assuming that everyone's got the sort of roof over their head taken care of. But, when this economic collapse comes, it's going to come in a heartbeat. We've already seen this in certain communities around the country. Indeed, one not very far away from where Brian and I live in Devon, Oakhampton, a market town, a traditional market town in the middle of Devon, mid-Devon, sits between the moors. And in February of last year, two of the major employers, in fact the only two major employers in Oakhampton, closed the gates of their facilities. No warning. I don't believe there was any collusion. It's just one of those incredible synchronicities where these two employers closed their gates on the same morning. Now, these were employers that had been in the town for many, many years. In fact, in some cases, there were 3 generations working in these plants. And when people got up at 8 o'clock in the morning, it was just a normal morning. 1 hour later, their world had been rocked. This was a travesty, because this was a significant source of income for the community. Well, the local mayor called an emergency meeting, and he asked his treasurer how much money they had in the town coffers. And he was told, well, we don't actually have any, sir. And I said, well, why not? He said, well, it's because we've done what we were advised to do by the Labour government, and we invested all our money in Icelandic banks. That's why many, many local authorities are completely broke, because they followed the Labour instruction to invest their funds in Icelandic banks. Coincidence? I think not. Anyway, the mayor had no experience of anything like this, so what he did was he said, okay, well, we're starting with a blank sheet of paper. What can we do here? And one of his councillors had a contact with a food charity. Now, this food charity was primarily engaged with distributing food parcels in Eastern Europe. But they contacted them and got them to come over to Oakhampton. So this isn't the the northeast, or South Wales, or Glasgow. This is mid-Devon. And to this day, 15, 16 months later, this food charity still comes in twice a month to distribute food parcels to families that cannot feed their families based on the benefits and other allowances that they're getting. So when it comes, it's coming quick. So before you start thinking about the gold, you've got to start thinking about stocking up on food and water. Now, of course, what this does is it takes away the fear. In Iceland, when the new government was elected, the Prime Minister, a woman, said, nobody is going to lose their home because of the actions of our rogue bank system, which took away the fear that anyone was going to be sleeping on the streets. The second thing she said was, nobody's going to starve. We are all in this together. And of course, because she made those statements, people really did feel that it was a community here. Now, I don't see our government of millionaires ever participating in the austerity measures in any way, shape or form. The way in which the Icelandic government stimulated the economy, they actually took the game of monopoly as a base idea, because they needed to stimulate the economy. And so they kicked around a number of ideas as to how they could stimulate the economy. And somebody suggested, well, what about like the game of Monopoly? Well, the problem is with Monopoly, everybody's given money. And they didn't want to do that. They didn't just want to give people money. So what they did was they actually had all of their council leaders, the equivalent council leaders, draw up lists of community projects. And this could be anything from painting the home of the elderly or filling potholes in the roads or whatever that needed to be done within the community. And they said, whatever skills you have, forget that. If you're not working and you're able-bodied, you step forward and you pick a community project. And you undertake that community project, and in return, you get the new currency, which is effectively krona issued by the People's Bank of Iceland. So it's put into the economy not as debt. If businessmen needed to borrow money, they could borrow money at an appropriate rate of interest, but of course the interest came back to the People's Bank. It didn't go to the private bankers. The private bankers have effectively been kept out of Iceland. Now do you start to understand why it is that you're not reading anything about Iceland in the mainstream media? Because our government of millionaires who are in the pockets of the banksters don't want anybody to know that there is a completely viable and workable solution that's in operation, albeit in a small country, 300,000 people like Iceland, but it could equally be applied anywhere else. You just have to get out of the hock of the central banks. But we don't have any politicians that have the balls, even if they have the capacity to understand how the fractional reserve banking system works, which I doubt many do, but they don't have the balls to stand up and challenge the establishment. And this is what's going to have to happen. Now, fortunately, more and more people are starting to wake up. They are starting to realize, we've got a whole generation, the under 35s, a whole generation that do not have the opportunity that was afforded to those of us who are in our 50s and 60s and older. My father, who's in his 80s now, is probably the last generation to have been able to provide for the family on a working man's wage, where my mother didn't even need to think about going to work until such time as I and my sister had left home. My father was a lift engineer with the GLC. His job was maintaining the lifts in the low-rise council blocks in South London. He worked a 40-hour week or 45-hour week or whatever it was back then. I can't remember him ever working weekends, and I certainly don't remember him working overtime. Yet he was able to provide for the family. You know, we were able to have 2 weeks holiday every year, okay, not in Benidorm, but, you know, the likes of Clacton or wherever, or Teignmouth. One of the reasons I live in Devon is because of a family holiday that we had down there when I was about 9 or 10, and I remembered the area. That can't happen today. It can't happen. There's no way that somebody doing a working, a labourer's job or even a technician's job, there's no way they can earn enough to provide for their family. You know, which is why we've got situations where women are having their first child in their mid-30s. There's another reason linked to fertility, but, you know, economically, people can't even afford to think of having a family until they're in their mid-30s. So the age of 20, or the 20s, are almost barren, you know, because we've got the girls who have their kids at 16, 17 and 18 as an opportunity to get out of the family home and be provided with local authority housing. And then we have those who are working who don't have children until they're in their 30s. You know, we saw in the media yesterday that there is now the admission that property prices are still 30% higher than they should be. This is not rocket science. You know, properties have to come down, actually probably more than 30%, but they daren't tell you that right now. They just got to, you know, feed you in little by little. The average salary in this country right now is £26,000. The average family income is £38,000. The average house price in this country right now is £260,000. And let me tell you that a family living with 2 kids, living on £38,000 a year, ain't going to have a deposit for a £260,000 home anytime soon. It's going to take them until they're in their 40s to have probably saved up enough for the deposit. So the bottom line is prices have to fall. I mean, they should fall right now, but, you know, we've got greedy estate agents that tell everybody that the house is worth about 50% more than it really is, which is why nothing's moving. And until such time as first-time buyers can come into the market again, the market will remain stagnant. You know, a few properties might sell here and there, especially when the bankers get their bonuses. But the reality is that there's no real market. So, to protect yourself in the short term, start thinking about stocking up on food and water so you don't care. You're insulating yourself. You get yourself into a situation where, God forbid, but if the worst happens, you can shut your doors, pull the blinds, and hunker down for a few weeks. Because, you know, there's so many people out there who, despite the fact that everything I'm telling you is being reported, the vast majority of people are not joining the dots. And so when it does happen, it's going to be like Okehampton, where, you know, at 8 o'clock in the morning it's a normal day, but by noon it's a whole different world. And the shelves in the stores are going to empty in a heartbeat. So food and water, and then start thinking about what you're going to do with any surplus. Leave it in the banks, you might as well kiss it goodbye. And that's as soon as September, October, because as I've observed now for the last 6-7 years, the agenda of those who think they are the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom is to have their global government in place, at least in basic framework, by the end of this year. And they're behind schedule, which is why, you know, they're looking to use events like the final pulling of the rug under the global economy to accelerate that agenda, because the only way out of it is to create a global government. But there's another event coming up, of course, in the meantime, starting next Friday, the Olympics. And I think they're going to use the Olympics. In fact, I believe that they're telling us, and in fact, on Wednesday night at the Holiday Inn in Camden Lock, I am going to present all of the evidence which I believe is the establishment telling us what's going to happen. They always tell us what's going to happen. It's just that the vast majority of people refuse to see it. In 1915, the German embassy in New York took out a full-page advertisement in the New York Times stating that the Lusitania was a legitimate military target. Nobody could say that they hadn't given due warning. But of course, the vast majority of people who were due to sail on the Lusitania elected, well, they either didn't see it or they were elected not to take any notice of it. And I think the Lusitania was lost with about loss of 800 lives. I think about 1,200 survived. They always tell us what they're going to do. And I will produce the evidence on Wednesday to show that there was the opportunity to see that something was going to happen before 9/11. The same with the London bombings, and the same now at the Olympics. And the papers today are full of this incident in Aurora, Colorado, where a 24-year-old man shouts, "I am the Joker," before opening fire with an assault rifle at midnight screening of the new Batman film, The Dark Knight, in Denver. Aurora is a suburb of Denver. This is false flag. Once again, the people of the US were told that this was probably going to happen. A May the 17th memo posted online by the FBI stated that they had intelligence that there may well be an attack in a public place like a cinema on May the 17th. So here we are in mid-July, so just 2 months later, and effectively exactly what was presented in that memo of May the 17th occurs here. And of course, Obama is due to sign a UN treaty in a few weeks, which would require the US to initiate the disarming of their citizens. How fortunate for Obama that this event should go down just a couple of weeks before he's due to sign that treaty. If this event had occurred in Texas or in Florida, the guy might have got off a couple of shots before he'd have had about 30 plus bullets in him from all the people who were legitimately carrying firearms. But Denver has some of the strictest firearm control laws in the US. So this was the safest place for this lone gunman who managed to get off at least 71 shots, because I believe the body count at the moment is about 71. I'm not sure whether they're all terminal or injured, but anyway, he's hit 71 people. Now that's either an extremely good marksman or he wasn't alone. And of course, the good news is that more and more and more people are waking up to this kind of bullshit. And so right now, unlike 9/11, where there was a handful of us trawling the information that was in the public domain because we could see that the physical evidence didn't support the official version of events. But fortunately today, 11 years later, there are literally thousands or tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of people who are suspicious. And so here we are, basically less than 24 hours or so, 36 hours after the event, and already the information is starting to come out. Unfortunately, of course, the media will dismiss any alternative view as the rantings of conspiracy theorists. All we can do is simply encourage people to take a look at it for themselves and come to their own realization. Nothing happens by accident, and as we are certainly becoming increasingly aware, in almost every circumstance like this, there is prior warning. Within the perverse belief system of those who believe themselves to be the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom, they actually believe they have to tell us what it is that they're planning to do. Because by telling us, and then us not reacting, they believe that that gives them a mandate to then pursue their pernicious agenda. And the most powerful tools in their armory are our apathy, our abdication, and our willful ignorance. And the most powerful of those three is abdication, because by definition, abdication means that we've got some idea of what's occurring, but we still do nothing. We say, well, it doesn't affect me. I'll give you some examples. I mean, the Daily Mail. I have to tell you, I am an avid reader of the Sun and the Daily Mail. The reason I read those two papers is because by reading those papers, I have a pretty good idea what a significant chunk of the adult population in this country believes to be the gospel truth. So it's a pretty good place to start. But I have to say that the Daily Mail has been starting to run some articles which a few years ago would have been dismissed as the domain of the conspiracy theorist. I mean, the Daily Mail ran an article that said 100,000 elderly people were effectively dying unnecessarily in care homes and in NHS hospitals due to lack of care. It was then revealed that many hospitals actively practice what they call the death pathway. This is euthanasia. They're telling us there's euthanasia, but it doesn't affect your mum or my gran. So we say, okay, well, it's not a problem. But for those people who do have relatives in the system, it's a nightmare. We had the case in Tooting Bec, 2-3 weeks ago, of the young lad, 22, who called the police because he was desperate for a drink of water. And when the police arrived, the hospital staff turned them away and said, no, everything's under control. Don't worry, everything's under control. The guy died of thirst, as was established in the coroner's court a few weeks ago. This is not the society that we have been led to believe it is. It's a brilliant construct that's been created, certainly over the last 70-odd years. We, the vast majority of us in this room, are not the target. The targets are the generation coming through. The school children who are required to give fingerprints to get their school lunches. The school children who are being trained in facial recognition or to accept facial recognition software as the facial recognition cameras log them as they walk through the school gates. All of this was remarkably foreseen by Zbigniew Brzezinski back in the 1960s when he wrote his book Between Two Ages, The Technotronic Era. A book he wrote in the 1960s and published in 1970. If you want to see, how the game plan was put down in print 43 years ago, to literally track us through every possible move. And I think Mike Mitchum is going to talk briefly later about smart meters, because when smart meters are introduced into your house, there will be the software to literally track people's behaviors. With Google, they have a guy called Meng, who is basically a neuroscientist, and his job within Google is to develop the techniques for neuroprogramming. To literally program people as they search on the web. By the way, this particular individual who perpetrated this event was apparently studying neuroscience at a local university. So was he picked out for some special reason here? More and more people are starting to question what's occurring, and one by one they're stepping off the grid. They're stepping off the grid. They're not making a big song and dance about it, which is the smart way to do it. I'm certainly not in any way knocking people who do make a big noise about what they do, because we need those people, obviously, so that it does get some attention. But what scares the crap out of those who think they're the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom is those people who quietly just go off grid, who quietly find ways to not conform. Don't make a big deal about it. Don't attract the attention, but just step off of the hamster wheel or step off of the plank, propping up the establishment. What's so important right now is that people elect individual actions. This is not a time for joining societies, although obviously, like joining or getting together with like-minded people is important. But, we don't need organizations. The establishment love organizations because they can infiltrate them. They can make them impotent. They can find ways to make them completely ineffectual. What scares the crap out of them is individuals who are all doing their own thing. It's what I call a community of shared interest. The Occupy movement, unfortunately, perhaps had a lot of potential when it kicked off last September in New York and rapidly spread around the world. But tragically, what we've seen is that the under 35, and I'm being generic here because there were many people participating in Occupy outside of this age group, but what we have generally seen is that the under 35s were certainly able to mobilize in terms of the Occupy movement, but they weren't able to get themselves organized in any way, shape or form. And I don't mean by setting up a hierarchy, but they weren't able to actually establish any coherent strategy. And of course, they were very quickly infiltrated. But this is the generation that's really going to suffer. The opportunity is with Middle England right now. The working classes have never, in all history, the working classes have never initiated social change. They've tried, by God they've tried, but every time they've tried, they've been brutally beaten back. It's only when the middle classes realise that they are being totally screwed over by the establishment, and if they don't wake up and start to do something about it, they're going to lose everything that they have worked their whole lives to accumulate. And if you lose it, well, you've certainly got nobody to pass, there's nothing to pass on, which means that we add to the condemnation of the next generation to live their lives in absolute abject economic slavery. So if you're not going to do it for yourselves, at least let's do it for the children, for the next generation. This is a long game. We're not going to see the fruits of our efforts tomorrow or the day after or the day after that. It's a long game. It's like the fluoridation that you heard Walter speaking about earlier. These guys are not stupid enough to try and fluoridate the water supply of the whole country in one go. They'll do it bit by bit by bit. They've got the Northeast, they've got Birmingham, and as we saw, was it beginning of last year, they went for Southampton. They held the public meeting. Everybody who attended that meeting, including Scott Tipps, President of the National Health Federation, everybody who attended that meeting stated their categoric objection to the fluoridation of the water in Southampton. And the local water authority said, well, thank you very much for letting us know what you think, but we're going to do it anyway. Total disregard, but they went through the consultation process. Well, that's what's going to happen right across the country. They don't care whether it takes 10, 20, 30 or 40 years. They'll just do it. We have to wake up a lot quicker. People are waking up a lot quicker. And I believe that we're on the cusp of that awakening accelerating at a phenomenal rate of knots. So I'm going to finish. Just consider this one thought. Consider the possibility that everything we've been talking about, this pernicious agenda of those who think they're the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom, which is about forcing humanity into abject economic slavery and potentially worse. But consider the possibility that they're actually doing us a massive favour. Because in our personal lives, it's only when we go through massive drama or massive trauma which rocks our world, which takes us outside of our routine, like occurred in Oakhampton. On a personal level, sometimes it's perhaps relationship related or career related or finance or health. But when drama comes into our life or trauma comes into our life, it rocks us out of this routine. And we have to start perhaps thinking about, what we're doing. Perhaps thinking about, our thoughts or our actions or what we can do differently, what we need to do differently. Because if we don't address the issue, then it's going to come back and bite us again or again or again. For me, if I hadn't seen what I saw in Kuwait in 1991, I definitely wouldn't be standing up here right now. It took me 7 years to integrate what I saw in Kuwait. in the run-up to 9/11, I knew that something of enormous significance was about to occur. I didn't know what. And when 9/11 occurred, I knew that this was the event that I'd been aware that was about to occur. I don't claim any special insight. I was simply watching George Bush and watching the fact that he was spending most of his time in Crawford or on the golf course, and at very little time in Washington. I knew he was on the bench being groomed for something. And when 9/11 happened, I knew this was it. It still took me 7 months of constant research to establish in my own mind beyond any reasonable doubt that 9/11 was an inside job. So the combination of Kuwait and 9/11 is what triggered me into effectively doing what I do today. Other events that have occurred, whether it's the London bombings or the combination of events, whether it's the global financial meltdown, whether it's the fact that your kids can't get work and they're still living at home in their mid-20s or whatever, or 30s or worse. But more and more people are starting to realize that something ain't quite right. But consider the possibility that these guys are actually giving us a kick up the backside. They're giving us an opportunity to wake up to the fact that we have the potential to be a damn sight more than economic slaves. And right now, that choice lies with each and every one of us. So I'm going to close just with this picture, which also is from the Occupy movement. It's time to get off our butts. It's time to start really making a difference. It's time to stand up and be counted. And as I said earlier, if we're not going to do it for ourselves, let's actually recognise that there's a generation coming behind us. And I, for one, am not proud of the legacy that we are leaving them behind. But I know we can change it. Thanks very much.